Today we have the Reverend Winnie Varghese, and our discussion is going to be about inclusion. So let's first get to know Winnie a little bit. When you think, I always say, when you think about the South Asian person, you can take them just by themselves, right? They come with fathers, mothers, uncles, aunts, cousins, great uncles, second cousins, eighth cousins, and they're all usually all up in our faces, right? So tell us a little bit about your family and what did that unit look like? What were the members like? Just a little bit about your family.
So my family might be different than what you just described. In like one kind of marked feature of our family is that both of my fathers, most of my grandfathers, my mother's father and my father's father, are disinherited. So we are a kind of an isolated family in a community of people that have extensive family relationships. So I'm often introduced to people through some people that are here, actually, that's happened, that are related to me, but I don't know them, and my family doesn't know them because of this distance. So, which I actually take as a great gift to be an Indian with a little bit of space, frankly. But my parents are both from Kerala.
Yeah.
My mother is from Kottayam, and is from a family that's been there for a long time. So we're related to a lot of people that come from Kottayam. And my father is from Kaviyur, which is near Tiruvalla. There's some people on this call from Kaviyur because Kaviyur represents well, but it's a very, very small place. It's like a country place. And I grew up in Dallas. My dad and mom came in 1970 and 71, which makes me very, very old. And they were in that first generation where all the Indians lived in the same apartment building because they all went to 2 grad schools, like that generation of people. So we're really old. And, part of the gift of that time is we were the only ones. So we got to define ourselves. Yeah. And that was the loneliness of that time as well. We were the only ones, right? So I was the only one in my school. I remember learning English as a kid and thinking that was just what we did, and knowing that, and knowing we were different and not how. But it also meant, frankly, that we didn't face racism in the same way that later generations did because there weren't as many of us. So it was a really unique time in the 70s in Dallas. And early 80s. My family is my parents and my brother, Paul Varghese, who is a comedian in Dallas. He's the famous one of our family. His personality is much more like yours than mine. He's really fun. And then my dad had a brother that was here when I was growing up. So I had 2 cousins. And later my mom had a sister that was here, but we were pretty much on our own. And there was a network of us that were Marthama and Jacobite around the country in the 70s. And it was so scattered that Sidhu Chandy was on this call and I have a baptism date just a couple of days apart because the Marthama bishop came from India to baptize like these 4 or 5 babies that had been born in this country and did a little tour. And all of our baptism dates are just a couple of days apart. So we're from way back then. And now my family is also my partner, Elizabeth, and our kids, Mia and Tomas, who are 22 and 24 and just out of college.
Oh, that's amazing. Very cool. Very cool. Did you grow up going to church?
Yeah. In Dallas, again, it was so long ago that my dad said his priest's advice was to go to the Episcopal church because that's as close as you could get to a Marthama church in the US. Uh-huh. My mother is a staunch Jacobite woman. So even though they attend a CSI congregation now, she's very clear that if we could, that she's doing the best she can to support her family, but we're not quite on the right path. Right? So she's a very faithful Jacobite woman. And they did evening prayer when I was a kid, and we would pray in the evenings, and I hated it as a kid. It meant that we'd have to turn off whatever we were watching on TV, and it was embarrassing, and then they would sing in Malayalam, and it would go on forever. But I remember that's the memory I have of their piety, of listening to them pray in Malayalam for us, for their families, for their needs, and really opening their hearts in prayer. That's my earliest memories of faith are listening to my parents in that evening prayer that we did every evening. But I grew up going to the little Marthama congregation that they were building, and then the little CSI congregation that they were building. At first they met together because there were so few of us, And then the Marthamites built multiple multi-million-dollar buildings. And for some reason, my dad we didn't do that, even though we are Marthamites. And we joined the CSI group, which was a very small group, which meant we had this very improvised church. We didn't have a priest for a long time. We did morning prayer together. Our parents made the service together. And it was a lot of men. I think the dads wanted to create an alternative space for whatever reason, for different reasons. And almost all of their wives were Catholic or Jacobite. And so were mortified by this and wanted to go to a proper church, but were traditional enough that they were going to go where their husbands went. And so it was a really interesting mix of kind of building our own thing with a lot of tradition attached as well. And we did, at some point, my dad had the key, so we had to go early to open it up. And it was that kind of beginnings of a new community.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about, as far as like models that you had, right? Of like what a Christian was as a young person. Was there someone in your family, someone in your community, someone in these churches that really made an impact?
Yeah, I'm just going to say, I just see in the chat that someone has said that the United Methodist Church is closest to the Marthama Church. That is a scandalous comment, and I've noticed it. We will come back to that. Yeah, my brother's name is Paul Varghese, not on accident, right? So if you're from where we're from in Kerala, everybody knows who Paul Varghese was. A Jacobite bishop was still alive when my brother was named, and he was on the World Council of Churches, an advocate for liberation theologies and social justice, had a really broad sense of, in a new India and a world emerging out of colonialism, what the gospel meant for Black and brown people and for nation building. Really prophetic and powerful. And my brother was named on purpose. And almost anyone named Paul Varghese is named that for him.
Yeah.
So there's that part of my parents' belief of what it means to be Christian. And George Ninan Bishop, who died a few years ago, I posted today's death anniversary is today. I posted it. And my dad said, oh yes, my neighbor from Kaviur, my childhood friend, right? Like he was just a little bit older than my dad. There's this, this communist movement that comes out of that part of Central Kerala and Kaviur in particular. Like the only school, my dad said when he was growing up, all their teachers were Marxists. That's who came to teach in those schools. And so there's this really strong political orientation towards land reform and thinking about poverty and justice, right alongside hearing the Gospels and and being a Marthamite or CSI or Jacobite in that community. That for people like my dad, where there were priests and my mom that had gone to Union Seminary, there was this really strong influence of liberationism in that generation, in that community. And you see it actually in Koshi, right? Like that's like he's got that as well. And I was really formed by that. Like that's how my parents talked about what should have happened in church, or what the slight alteration of the sermon we heard, or how we should think about what we just read. And so between the two of them, I had a very strong sense of very liberal, open, intellectual, thoughtful, justice-oriented Christianity.
How interesting, huh? So it was the Bible and Karl Marx.
Yeah, they never said Karl Marx, but Paul Varghese was close enough. Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. So let's skip a few years later. You're in school, you're studying, and you're doing your homework, and you say it or you realize that you're queer. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so for as open-minded as my family was, and they really are, right? My parents are the people that other young people came to talk to if they had to tell their parents something difficult, right? And my parents would go help with that. It's almost as though like my brain or my body knew that being gay was too much. That was the one thing that would be too much. And it's almost like it didn't let me know. One of my good friends, a close friend who's Indian, came out to me our senior year of high school. And I remember thinking about her, oh, that's going to be so hard. Your mother is so terrible. Like, what are you going to do? Thinking, oh, how would you do that? And it never even occurred to me it had anything to do with me. And then there I am 6 months later, away from home and just reading for class. And it occurs to me that, oh, that's me. And my first thought was, oh, I should call my dad. He'll be so happy that I finally figured this out. I knew there's something. And I had been kind of edgy and weird for a couple of years. Like, what was it? And my second thought was, oh yeah, maybe I shouldn't call him right away. Maybe I should think about that. And I can laugh about it, but it also was so sad. I was 17 years old and I was really close to my parents. And I love my dad, and we're the same person in so many ways, you know, like we are so much like each other. It was the first time I thought there's something I can't tell him, you know,
Yeah.
and I wonder what would have happened if I had told him.
Yeah.
Probably not good, but I wonder, and I didn't tell him. I didn't tell him for a while. But my first feeling was that I felt so free, and things felt true, and I felt like I had kind of entered my body again, and I hadn't known that any of those things weren't true, but it just felt so true. So I've never been able to deny it because it had nothing to do with anyone but me, right? I had this moment of like, oh, that's what it is. um, but the sad part was, you know, within minutes I realized I shouldn't tell anyone that I loved, because I didn't know what they would do, what would
Yeah.
happen next.
Yeah. But the immediate feeling of this is who I am and being happy about it, do you now realize what a blessing that is?
Yeah, no, I feel so lucky in so many ways, and I feel like as much as I knew I shouldn't tell them,
Yeah.
I got that from them. You know, from that, it's a very, like, as controlling and problematic as our communities can be. A
Yeah.
piece that I got was
Yeah.
that there's nowhere you can go to run away from God, right? That you are God's, and I had that really deep in me from them, I think, and from their own kind of resistance and their own piety, that they would, in their own practice, clearly they didn't completely agree with everything that was happening in church or in really in the conservative culture around us in Dallas of Christians. And so they had their, like, they would help, they kind of showed us how to interpret, I think, as kids. And for me, I think in some ways I inherited their faith, and I feel very, very grateful for that.
Yeah. Because God is always with us, right? No matter what, right? Yeah. And was this around the time where you started thinking, hey, maybe I need to not only think about doing this type of work in academia, but maybe I should go to seminary school and become a priest?
Well, the great irony of it, right? And in the church, we would call it a call,
Yeah.
except that I don't really come from the part of the church that says we have calls, like, in that way. But it was the same moment for me,
Yeah.
same moment that I thought, oh, right, I'm gay, and gay is the word I thought. I wouldn't probably use that for myself now. I would have said I'd say queer now, but I thought,
Yeah.
oh, I'm gay. I thought, oh, I've got to be a priest. Like, who could be about anything but this? Because I had this sense, and I talk about it all the time, of just freedom. Like, what else would you do with your life but this, if you've experienced this? It happened in, like, in exactly the same moment. Um, and then I had more rational thoughts after that. And one of them was like, are women priests? I'd never seen one. Like, I'm not sure that's a thing.
Yeah.
But it was like a call. It was so clear these were the two things that should happen.
Very cool. Very cool. Then you go to seminary school
Mm-hmm.
and you started learning, right? Was there the education that you got, were there parts of it that was contradictory to what you believed or what you were taught growing up?
You know, what's interesting about the way I grew up, and again, I feel very lucky for it, is that the thing that was most difficult for me in seminary was that some of my colleagues at Union were so conservative. You know, I just didn't know that people that thought about liberation were conservative. I just thought they were, you know, I thought we were all kind of on the same page, and I was really confused by friends that came from Pentecostal traditions or Baptist traditions or Episcopal traditions that were in any way kind of clinging to the tradition. I thought everybody was as open and flexible as I was, and interestingly, they were conservative and homophobic. I wasn't ready. I didn't. I thought I'd go to Union and that would be settled. And
Yeah.
so the academic life of Union, of kind of looking at the text and looking at that critically and trying to understand the Bible in the, you know, for what it was, and understand theology from where it had come from, and understand power and race and colonialism and gender and sexuality, that part all made sense to me because I feel like I had been raised with little bits of that, and I knew that was coming. But I was surprised at, I didn't know a lot about the really conservative traditions, frankly. I had heard them in school, but frankly, my parents had always told me that wasn't like a proper way to be a Christian, so to not pay too much attention to it. So I didn't. So I was surprised, and many of my queer friends in seminary
Yeah.
were coming out of those traditions, and so felt a lot of self-hate and doubt and worry. I felt that from my culture. It was clear to me that it was culture, that my parents had a sense of what my life should be like and what respectability meant in our community and all that, and that I was breaking all of that. And I felt so much sadness for causing that pain in their lives. And I felt a lot of sadness for not being allowed to live as myself and my family, for losing my family. But I didn't feel that it was a Christian, it had never come to me as part of my faith. It had come to me as part of my culture.
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. So let us start getting the Bible, right? Before we talk a little about inclusion, I just want to start off by saying, like, I think, like, for myself, a lot of folks that grew up in the church, right? In the Christian faith, you see the pastor, the priest, the reverend stand up for a lot of us, and we've heard the pastors and the priests say that homosexuality is an abomination, right? That you are an abomination of God if you are homosexual. So, Reverend, my first question is, are we an abomination of God? Is our acts of love an abomination of God?
So first of all, I hear that Koshi answered this very well last week. And also, um, that we're so used, in some ways, we're so used to hearing that language that we don't note how triggering and awful it is.
Yeah.
Like, I'm really sorry that you had to say that out loud, that people had to hear that. Those are horrible, horrible ideas. It's horrible. It's traumatizing. And just because we're used to it doesn't mean that we should. I'm not saying that you shouldn't have said what you said, but it's horrible. Like, what you just said is horrible, right? I feel so lucky, again, that one, I don't understand Malayalam very well, so if people were saying that, I didn't know those words. But two, I don't think they were. I just don't think we were actually paying that much attention to sexuality in my little church. In our churches, I think they were more concerned that we married well and did well in school. But I didn't grow up in a kind of Christianity where there was a lot of time spent on homosexuality. Mostly, I think, out of homophobia. I think nobody would have said those words, right? But I didn't grow up with that. And I'm so grateful I didn't. But I know a lot of people on this call did. A lot of people do. And one, I don't want to be flip about it, because I think there's a reason that sexuality and reproductive choice and gender are the places where we use the language of abomination, right? That is the religious right and a very particular cultural and political moment in our country. Because we weren't always talking about this as Christians, and the church in India wasn't talking about this, and often still isn't, right? It's a very particular cultural moment that came with Reagan and a response to the civil rights movement. There's a lot of great writing about it that made this the focal point, that made life hell for a lot of queer kids and queer people. But that isn't who we've always been. And so there's that, right? The church has not, for 2,000 years, been preaching about homosexuality as an abomination. That just isn't the truth of the focus of the church. But you would think so if you have been around since 1980, which is all of our lives, right? So it makes sense that we talk about it that way, but we need to know for the larger frame, this is not the ultimate concern of the Christian church. And then next, this language of abomination, big, horrible word. The number of things that are abominations in Leviticus that you literally could not be bothered about today, if I read you the list, helps for context, right? So if you don't believe me, please go back and look. Just look up abomination in the Bible. There's these things that we joke about, as the Malayalis joke about all the things we can't eat, right? Like, you can't have shellfish, you can't have linens that are mixed. There's all these things that are called abominations. And this is not to make fun of another tradition, but just to say that there are rules. There was a set of rules about what you were supposed to do, what defined a community. There were things you're going to eat, you were not going to eat. There were ways you're going to wash, and there were ways you're going to organize your family, right? And all of those things were being organized in Leviticus, and the language of abomination is used. But again, for things we would never look to the Bible. What the Bible says we would never do. We would not find that to be an appropriate guideline for us. We're not going to stone our children for talking back to us. We're going to eat what we want to eat. Like, we're not going to do those things. But the word abomination is placed next to every one of those acts with the punishment for that. And so we need to notice that there's a lot that we're doing nothing about. And then there's a couple where we're saying, well, but that one still works for us. That's still a prejudice we hold, or that's still a bias we hold. So I would say not at all are your acts of love an abomination. In no way is love an abomination. And even more, to be more forceful about that, if in 1 John, we know God in love, says the Bible, as you get to the very end, right? If you think the order matters at all, right? How is God known to us? It says God is known to you in love. And so seek love and seek to love so that you might know something of the quality of God, of the nature of God, and if how you love is ordered to people of the same gender. If your gender is more creative than some of ours, and how you express love is more creative than the categories that the culture right now says are the most acceptable, it's not simply that you might choose to conform or not conform or be a little rebellious or look at the text a little differently. It's that for Christians, we say that God is known in love. So to limit how someone loves is actually in the world of what is actually an abomination. That might be a more appropriate place to place that word in this time.
So Sodom and Gomorrah, right? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is used constantly to say homosexuality is wrong because of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Yeah. What's the deal with Sodom and Gomorrah?
Well, one, I really wanted to pass this one off to Ranjit, but I'm happy to talk about it. Yeah, Sodom. There's a really interesting writing. It's worth looking at when the church decides to use this, right? So that's a whole other lecture that I'm happy to give at some point. But the more brief way to talk about this is, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah is that Lot is living in this town. I think it's Lot. Yeah, Lot's living in some town. Abraham's living out, not in the town. And really kind of the site of sin in this early period are the towns. Basically they're having a big debate about settledness is the story of Abraham. So Lot is the nephew of Abraham. Lot goes to live in town. He can't handle this living out in the woods with his uncle anymore. And he receives guests. And when the guests come, the people of the town basically say, and the guests are male, we want to rape them. You've got guests, we're going to rape them. There's a weird power anti-hospitality play. Like, you've got outsiders in a culture where hospitality was so significant because they're living out in the desert, right? There's not a lot of governance out there. And so being kind to travelers is a huge piece. And you see that in the story of Abraham. Right before then, Abraham receives guests, which turn out to be angels or prophets of some kind. They just come wandering in, and Abraham receives them with love, and that is the right way to receive a guest. These guests come to Lot's house, and the neighbors come and say literally that they're going to rape them. And or whoever, I can't remember, I'm not remembering the story correctly, but the solution is that they keep the guests in. They don't offer the guests, they offer their children instead, their daughters. And that happens. It's not anyway. So it's this horrible story about what you do with an outsider and a guest, like whether we welcome with hospitality and bring out the tea, or whether we establish power over because they're outsiders, right? Establish our dominance. And so it's not that people are choosing same-sex life partners and God says, yeah, not that. That's not what's happening there. And it's not that people are saying we've fallen in love, right? Or that we choose a life in a certain way. It is about power and dominance and brutality expressed in sexuality. And that's that story. So the issue is that story comes up again in the text. And it's clear when they talk about the sin of Sodom later in the Bible, they are talking about that act of hospitality and lack of hospitality, which is a very soft way to say how brutal what was proposed and what actually happened was. But it comes up in that way. And then that later has been used in the Christian tradition as a form of homophobia, but and kind of a defense for homophobia. But if you look at that original story, nobody is proposing anything like that as a just sexuality. And maybe the more scandalous thing to say is there is very little in the Old Testament that you read that is a form of sexuality or family life that anyone's going to want to imitate. Like, it's a hot mess telling us about different things in there, but it's not telling you how to organize your family.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. Thank you so much for that. I saw in the chat someone said, so much to unlearn. That's for sure, right? Is there, I watched this documentary years ago when I was coming out, and it was called "For the Bible Tells You So." Have you watched it?
Yeah.
And this was the first time for me where I even thought about this, that there was a historical context to the writings in the Bible. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say about the Bible, and how to read it. And this is my coming out story. Is I was literally reading a text about how you read the Bible, and it was, I mean, it's like the nerdiest coming out story ever. But in reading, I had this moment of like,
We
it
love
all just made sense, right? Like that, so much of what I had heard my whole life made sense in light of how you could read this text. And so some of the principles to remember are there different kinds of literature. So if you remember from like thinking about what, like poetry or a short story or a novel or something like journalism, that there are all these different versions of writing, right? And of text for different reasons in the Bible. And they're trying to accomplish different things. And one of the ways that you can see that is sometimes if you just read in order, like in Genesis, you'll just read one creation story, and then you'll read another creation story right next to it, and they're different. So clearly, if they're trying to tell you a truth about how the world was made, you wouldn't do that. What they're telling you is people were telling multiple stories, and multiple versions of the story have landed in the text because they were important enough, and they're emphasizing different things about what matters about who we are and what our responsibility is to the world. And you find that about almost every major story as you go through, that there's just different stories, right? In Ecclesiastes or Proverbs, they're writing to people that will have power, about what it means to exercise power well, right? But then in Isaiah, they're writing, that is about what would it mean to be a just society. So you're hearing really different things with really different themes that literally contradict each other. And the other way to understand that, in terms of contradiction, sort of assumes that's on purpose. So another way to say that is it speaks in multiple voices. They're different books that were written at different times. They're different stories. They tell different, kind of emphasize different things, and might even seem to contradict each other in what they're saying. So you might read in Leviticus that a person with in any way compromised genitalia cannot come into the temple. And then you'll read in Isaiah, everyone will come into the temple, right? And that's the same book, right? And so there's a lot going on, and it cannot be read flat, right? It needs to be read for the audience that it's sort of intended for. And in light of, and we with some humility that we can't completely understand the context that they were in at the time. And we read also in light of the best that we know today about how we think about literature, history, archaeology, and also science, psychology, philosophy, how we understand ourselves.
Yeah. No, I think it's very important, right? Because I think, like, intellectually we understand that there's been a period, like, that these writings were written over a long period, but emotionally, and when we're reading it flat, right? So we just interpret it that way. Let's talk a little bit about how the Bible addresses inclusion of like queer and
Yeah.
trans. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I see a question. I'm happy to incorporate this question in a little bit too, this comment. One of the things that's important to understand is in the translation of what we get as homosexual in the RSV and the NRSV and the ESV, whatever version of the Bible you're reading, if you go back in translations, at some point someone decides to use that word. So it doesn't mean, I don't at all mean to say that there have not been people that have been, same gender oriented through time. Like you see that actually in ancient writings, that people fall in love. It's wonderful, powerful. But the idea of homosexual, of a person who is oriented in that way, and maybe exclusively in that way, or that word that's used in the text that we have a very specific definition of now, that's not a word that existed 250 years ago as a concept. And so they're taking Greek terms, and sometimes Hebrew terms, but overwhelmingly Greek terms, that usually what we have in the Bible, the terms that are used are about very specific physical acts. And what we have in the New Testament are acts that are happening in temples. So in temples to other gods. So Christianity is in that time in competition, right? They're trying to kind of win their turf with other traditions. And Paul and people that write in the school of Paul are basically saying, what does it mean to be one of us? What are the things that we get to do? What can we do? What can we not do in our community? And you see in the letters of Paul, different things in different communities, right? And some they're like, everybody be equal. And others are like, all the women should be quiet. And then some they're like, nobody cut their hair. Really different. And clearly he's speaking to the context of what's happening in those places. What does it mean for us to be set apart? And what set apart means is really different. But the term that's used, and there's a lot of great scholarship on this, what's worth looking up, that those terms are not something that would translate to what we mean by homosexual in particular now. The reason that's important is that the word that is translated is homosexual. And that's very different than very particular acts in very particular contexts. And often, like in those great German words where there's 25 letters, some of those Roman words or those Greek words that made sense in their time, and everybody would know the context, we end up having to write 15 words to explain that context because it's gone now. And so you end up with these clobbered passages that really aren't talking about being same gender oriented or same sex oriented in your affection. They're talking about something very different.
Okay. How does the Bible talk about, or you can share that it's really, we're all one, God's love is inclusive? Are there any parts of the Bible that you can refer to?
That God's love is inclusive?
Yeah.
Like all of it, right? Like you start at the beginning, and creation from the very beginning, and sometimes it's hard to see this, especially if you've come from a very judgmental tradition. But if you look at like Genesis 1, God generates creation out of, some would say out of a, like almost like it was essential. It wasn't a whim, right? But out of, God is in community, first of all. So that's pretty queer to begin with. Like God is in community. God creates and is delighted by everything God creates. And if and does it out of generosity and joy, that creation is good, like over and over and over in Genesis, it says that it's good. Creation is good, and that what is made is good, and the body is good, the animals are good, the land is good, the water is good. And then if anything, what happens is it's almost as though the created being cannot believe it, and will not accept it. And isn't that true to the human story, right? If you read it like that, isn't that true from the very beginning? Like, aren't we afraid that the parent isn't going to come, that we're going to be alone, that we might not be good enough? Seems to be the beginning of the story from the story of creation, we have that. And then we have them running in shame, right? And then kind of the story keeps going like that. So throughout, from the very beginning, you hear that. And then in the story, for us as Christians, in the stories of Jesus, Jesus keeps going to the most unacceptable places, to the border places, to the outside places, to say and to kind of challenge the story of who is included, who the message is for, who the message of liberation is for, who the message of God with us, choosing us is for. And then the disciples expand that out even further, right? And so it's ironic is not the word for how shocking it is that we end up with this racist, nationalist, kind of judgmental, like anti-body, anti-creation, abuse of this religion that has become the majority of contemporary Christianity.
Yeah.
It's really hard to find even in the text, frankly.
Yeah. Very
true. And of course it happens because power, the Bible speaks to it. Jesus speaks to it. The whole text speaks to it. Power, empire, power, will take what is good and pervert it for power.
Will take what's good and pervert it for power. Yeah, no.
It's the same words, but you turn them upside down and it means a very different thing, right?
Yeah, no, very true, very true. What we'll do is we'll start opening up for questions. I'm going to ask 2 more questions of the Reverend, and then we'll start with everyone else's question and answers. And when we start that, we'll stop the taping. So I'll start with a couple of questions. There are a lot of folks that are going to be listening to this, Winnie. There are folks that are part of this right now that have either left the church, right, are not in close connection with God, right? That are not praying, they're not worshiping, they're not reading the Bible, because they don't feel that acceptance, they don't feel the inclusion, they don't feel the love. So for the folks that are struggling right now, right, sort of reconciling their faith, their spirituality, their sexuality, their gender identity, what do you say to those folks?
Yeah, I'll tell you a really quick story because it was very convicting for me. I was in Chennai in 2009 at a conference, right? Yeah, and it was a meeting, and there were a number of trans women from Kerala, that had gone to Chennai because the surgery there is possible, that they could get treatment. They couldn't get treatment in Kerala at the time. Is very, as a Malayali, it was just so, it was horrifying. Like they had to flee Kerala, right, where we're supposedly so thoughtful to be in this place, to get what they needed. And it's a bunch of clergy, and we had all some of us had tried to make our points. It's a scary room full of clergy, and there's a panel of all trans women, and someone had said, "What do you want from us?" One of the ministers got up and said, "What do you want from us?" And I was ready for some like burn it down kind of talk.
Yeah.
And what she said was, in Malayalam, it was so devastating. I could understand this much Malayalam. She said, she said, I live alone in a slum. I have no family. I have no prospects. But I've chosen this life. But on Christmas, on the day of our Lord's birth, if I could just go to a church, but I know if I go, you'll reject me. But if I could just pray on that day with you. I mean, I don't think there was it was so convicting to me, because I think, I tend to think in like, how do we change the world? And of course, it's actually about hearts, right? Like these are just tender hearts trying to live on this planet with some freedom. And maybe I am too. And I don't face that too often because that's painful, right? But that's who we are. And what I would say is, you don't owe the church anything. You don't owe it anything. And you don't need the church for God. God is with you. That's for you. God reaches out to us in love constantly. And there's nothing you can do that shames God or keeps God from you or makes distance between you and God. It's not possible. But when you are ready, or when you need it, or when you can, I would say listen for that voice of love. Listen for it, because it's for you. If you find that your call is to help us at the church, God bless you. It would be so much better for us if you'd come in, and it'd be so good for us. But you don't owe that to anyone. The church has not been who we're supposed to be, and we haven't been trustworthy. But know that has nothing to do with how God loves you and seeks you out, and is waiting for you. And there is nothing you can do that pushes that away. And that's not for guilt. And that's not to say you're not doing enough. It's just there. It's just always there.
God's always there. You're right. Last question before we end taping. This organization that Aruna has created, and we should thank Aruna for creating this space. We owe Aruna a huge, greater debt for creating the space for us to be able to heal and talk and love. It's specifically for parents, right? Parents, family members who are struggling with accepting their child, right? So there are a lot of folks that, are dealing with their parents not accepting them, right? Because they're trans, because they're non-binary, because they're bi, because they're queer, right? And I think that the parents are also struggling, right? They feel like, very convicted to say, no, this is wrong. The church says this is wrong. The Bible says this is wrong. God says this is wrong, right? What do you say to those parents that are struggling?
Yeah, you know what? So I'm a parent, and what I will say is, if you are a parent, God has gifted you with children. It is a gift. It is a blessing and a gift. And to deny that gift, and to deny what your children have to teach you, which is the gift of children, right? That's a vocation you're putting down. And everyone knows this that goes to church. And right, and I say this as a priest in the church. There's a lot the church tells you that is crap and that you put down. There's a lot. There's a lot of mistaken teaching. There's some bad folks, and you've all encountered them, right? You exercise your judgment in that space. You do. And you better exercise it for those children that you are called to love. No one can love them like you can. And this idea that somehow love can be compromised with, or somehow put together with exclusion or judgment or hate. I mean, truthfully, what I would say is, if you're really trying to be a faithful Christian, look at your heart and your own disappointment in your own life and your relationship with your parents, and figure out what's happening in your family. You owe that to yourself. You owe that to God. You owe that to your children. But don't use the church as a crutch for that. That's a crutch. We can do a lot more than that. We can do a lot better. And the only reason we've all survived, and our families have all been through a lot, is that we have discerned what we need to be people of integrity and faith through the generations. None of us have done everything the church has asked us to do, right? We exercise discernment all the time in our families, where we talk about wanting to honor them and wanting them to be proud of us and accepting of us. Every family I know has done something that has infuriated the rest of their family, right? We're all, like, that's the nature of being a family. And you come back together. So this idea that there are these places where we will not do it, or that we cannot do it, I think it's one thing to say that I don't have the strength. I'm not a good enough parent. I can accept that. But to say someone else has forced me to not love my children, I don't accept that. I don't think that's acceptable.
Thank you. I applaud you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, Winnie. Thank you. For the folks that are listening to the recorded version of this, thank you for listening in. Please find us on Facebook, find us on Instagram. We're going to be getting our website up and running very soon, so we're very excited about that. But you can continue the conversation on Facebook and Instagram with us. You're welcome to join this community. We ask that you share this video with other folks so they all can get this very important message. Next Tuesday, we're going to be having the amazing Reverend Ranjit Koshi Matthews from Connecticut talk about God's love. So come back next Tuesday at 9 p.m. for this talk.